It began as the kind of story parents told themselves could never happen in their own town. The kind of quiet disbelief that comes when someone you trusted, someone who stood in front of your children with a calm voice and patient smile, is suddenly revealed to be something entirely different. For years, her students called her Ms. Ward. She was the teacher who stayed late, who made sure every child understood the lesson, who brought homemade cupcakes to class on Fridays. No one ever imagined that behind that careful routine was a secret that would end in murder. In the small Alabama town of Colbert County, 2010 had started like any other year. The local elementary school was preparing for spring exams, and 33-year-old Stephanie Ward was organizing a fundraiser for classroom supplies. Her husband, James Ward, worked construction out of state, and neighbors described them as distant but polite. What they didn't know was that months earlier, Stephanie had begun a relationship with a former student's father, a man named Darren Lee. What started as flirtation turned into something darker, a desperate dependency built on lies, threats, and manipulation. The affair was hidden carefully, but the tension was obvious to those who paid attention. Parents noticed she was distracted in class, grading papers late, leaving abruptly after school. One coworker recalled hearing her crying in her car, phone pressed to her ear, whispering, "I can't do this anymore." By February, her husband had returned home unexpectedly. That weekend, he discovered text messages that revealed the affair. Neighbors heard shouting that night, the kind of argument that rattled walls. 2 days later, James Ward was reported missing. The search began quietly. Police canvassed nearby woods and rivers, interviewing friends and family. Stephanie told investigators that her husband had stormed out after the fight, saying he needed space. For weeks, she went back to teaching as though nothing had changed, her smile brittle, her voice a little softer, but her presence steady. Parents brought her casseroles, thinking she was a woman abandoned. The sympathy in that town was palpable, but detectives were unconvinced. Cell phone data revealed that on the night James disappeared, Stephanie's phone had been active near a remote construction site 20 miles away. Security footage from a gas station showed her car at 2:14 a.m., hours after she claimed to be asleep. When officers questioned her again, her composure cracked. First came denial, then confusion, then a single tear that slid down her face before she said, "You don't understand what he did to me." It took another month before James's body was found, buried beneath loose gravel at that same construction site. The autopsy revealed he had been struck twice in the head with a blunt object, likely a tire iron, before being dragged to the pit. When confronted with the evidence, Stephanie confessed. Her voice on the interrogation tape is flat, almost detached. "He told me he was going to ruin me," she said. "He said he'd tell the school, take my job, take everything. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop." The trial in 2011 drew national headlines. The story of a respected schoolteacher turned murderer fascinated the public, not because the crime itself was unprecedented, but because of the image she had carefully built over years of trust and influence. The prosecution painted her as manipulative and calculated, arguing that she had lured her husband into a confrontation she planned to end violently. The defense claimed years of emotional abuse, psychological strain, and a moment of panic. During testimony, former students watched from the gallery. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the woman who once taught them multiplication tables and classroom manners, unable to reconcile her with the woman in handcuffs. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the verdict came, guilty of first-degree murder, Stephanie's reaction was almost imperceptible. A slow blink, a faint nod, as though she'd already accepted the inevitability of it. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her classroom was closed for weeks afterward. Children's drawings still hung on the walls, stick figures of a smiling teacher holding hands with her students beneath a sun made of yellow crayon. The image haunted those who returned to pack her things. The principal said later, "It wasn't just that we lost a teacher. We lost the idea that we could ever really know someone. Inside Tutwiler Prison, Stephanie became another inmate number. She joined the education program, teaching other prisoners basic literacy, almost as if trying to rebuild some fragment of the person she once was. In rare interviews, she spoke of regret, but never sought forgiveness. "I destroyed a life in my own," she said in one letter. "But people forget, I destroyed the trust of every parent who ever believed in me." Years later, documentaries revisited the case as a cautionary tale of hidden anger, secrecy, and the fragile line between victim and perpetrator. Viewers were left with a chilling realization that the very people we entrust with innocence can carry the most corrosive secrets. And perhaps that's what makes her story linger long after the verdict. Not just the crime itself, but the betrayal it represents. Because in every community there's a teacher who smiles kindly, who seems tired but gentle, who stays behind to help. And once in a while, beneath that calm exterior, there's something else entirely. A story waiting to unravel. One that will turn a classroom into the echo chamber of a tragedy no one ever saw coming. For more than 2 decades, he had been the backbone of the local high school, the kind of teacher everyone remembered long after graduation. Mr. Halston taught history, the Revolutionary War, the fall of empires, the slow march of power and corruption. He was known for his lectures, his quiet humor, the way he could make even the driest lesson sound alive. Parents admired him. Students trusted him, and no one could have predicted that behind those lessons on morality and civilization, he was hiding a crime that would destroy everything he'd ever built. The story began to unravel in 2017 in a quiet Midwestern town surrounded by fields and half-forgotten rail lines. The school's janitor had been cleaning late one night when he noticed a light still on in Halston's classroom. It wasn't unusual, he often stayed late grading papers, but something felt wrong. The blinds were half closed, and there was movement inside. The janitor approached, expecting to find Halston packing up. Instead, he found the man pacing, phone in hand, voice low, muttering something that sounded like a confession. The next day, Halston didn't show up for work. His car was missing, and so was a local college student he had mentored years earlier, a young woman named Evelyn, who'd once written that he had changed her life. Her disappearance drew immediate attention. Posters went up, search teams combed through nearby woods, and police questioned everyone who had contact with her in the days before she vanished. It didn't take long for Halston's name to surface. Detectives traced his movements through surveillance cameras and credit card receipts. A transaction at a hardware store for duct tape and rope, a motel check-in under an alias, a security camera catching his car at a gas station just an hour after Evelyn's last known sighting. When police found him 2 days later, parked at a rest stop and sitting motionless in his car, he didn't resist. He simply looked at the officers and said, "You found me sooner than I thought you would." What they uncovered was both calculated and senseless. In his trunk they found a notebook, his lesson planner, filled with scribbled pages that seemed to merge his teaching notes with fragmented confessions. "History repeats," one page read. "People fall because they think they're untouchable." Another line, "Empires crumble from within." Evelyn's body was found in a wooded area not far from a cabin Halston rented under a false name. The autopsy revealed she had been strangled, the marks on her wrists showing signs of restraint. Investigators pieced together a disturbing timeline. Months of secret communication, manipulation disguised as mentorship, and a pattern of control that mirrored his authoritarian classroom style. The man who once lectured about the rise and fall of tyrants had become one himself, the kind that hides behind intellect and respectability. The trial was a slow unmasking of the life he'd lived in parallel to the one everyone knew. Former students testified about his charisma, his confidence, the way he could make them feel seen. Others spoke of his temper, the quiet kind, the kind that simmered when someone challenged him. Prosecutors called it ego-turned-predatory. They showed text messages where he alternated between affection and threats. The defense tried to argue mental decline, the onset of depression and obsession, but the evidence was relentless. One moment from the trial haunted everyone who was there. The prosecutor asked why. After realizing what he'd done, he hadn't turned himself in. Halston paused, then said softly, "Because I thought I could explain it. I thought someone would understand." Those words echoed in the courtroom, a mixture of arrogance and despair, a man still believing he could teach his way out of damnation. When the verdict came, the town watched in silence. Life in prison without parole. A man who once shaped young minds, now condemned to spend his days in a place where time had no meaning. Reporters described the sentencing as eerily calm. He thanked the judge for listening and walked out with the same quiet gait he used in the school hallway. It was almost as if he accepted it as another chapter in history, his own downfall written like one of his lectures. The high school tried to erase his presence. His classroom was cleared, his name removed from the faculty list, his photographs taken down from the walls. But the memories lingered. The lessons, the stories, the quiet moments when he'd encouraged students to question authority. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Parents spoke about how betrayal felt different when it came from someone who had shaped your children's trust. In prison, Halston reportedly continued teaching, this time inmates studying for their GEDs. Those who interacted with him said he was polite, articulate, but distant, always writing, always reflecting. One guard recalled that he kept a stack of history books by his bed, all marked and underlined, as if still searching for a pattern in the failures of men. Years passed, and his name faded from headlines, but the story remained a cautionary whisper in the town. At reunions, when former students gathered and someone mentioned him, the room would grow quiet. Not out of fear, but disbelief. That the man who once taught them the difference between right and wrong could blur those lines so completely. There's something uniquely chilling about people like him. Those who understand morality so deeply they can articulate it, teach it, make others believe in it, yet still choose to betray it. Maybe that's what makes stories like his so unforgettable, because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always come in chaos or rage. Sometimes it comes in the calm voice of a teacher, standing before a blackboard, smiling as they explain the consequences of power, even as they're living proof of its corruption. It was supposed to be a new start. After years of teaching in overcrowded city schools, she had finally transferred to a quiet district in northern Arizona, the kind of desert town where time seemed to slow down. She'd told friends she wanted peace, less noise, fewer faces, a chance to breathe. Her name was Mrs. Carver, and for most of her new colleagues, she seemed perfect. Punctual, kind, efficient. Her classroom was immaculate, her lesson plans detailed, her tone always calm. But there was something about her eyes, a distance that students noticed first. They said she often stared out the window mid-lesson, her thoughts elsewhere. Some teachers assumed it was stress. No one guessed that at night, those same eyes were staring through the glass of her own living room, fixed on a man who lived across the street. His name was Daniel, 34, quiet, single, worked maintenance at the school part-time. Their first conversation had been harmless, a light flickering in her classroom, a short exchange about wiring. But it turned into something obsessive almost immediately. Within weeks, she was bringing him coffee, waiting for him in the parking lot, sending long text messages late at night. He didn't reciprocate, not really. He was polite, even friendly, but detached. That rejection festered. By the time spring came, her colleagues noticed a change. Mrs. Carver was jumpy, easily distracted. She'd lock her classroom door during lunch, scribbling in her journal instead of joining staff meetings. She stopped returning calls from friends. The students described her as nicer but weirdly sad. What no one knew was that she had begun following Daniel, to the grocery store, to the gym, sometimes even driving behind his car for miles. She filled pages of her notebook with his routines, his gestures, the sound of his voice. One night, Daniel reported his tires slashed. A few days later, his porch light shattered. He suspected local teenagers. When his dog was found dead, he called the police. There was no evidence, just a vague feeling that he was being watched. Officers advised him to install a camera. That same week, the footage caught a shadowy figure approaching his yard at 2 a.m. A woman wearing a hoodie, holding something in her hands. When police paused the frame and zoomed in, they saw her face clearly. It was Mrs. Carver. The arrest stunned the town. News stations arrived by morning, the kind of small-town spectacle that leaves everyone whispering at grocery stores and gas pumps. At first, she denied everything. Claimed she'd been out walking, that she'd gone to his house to apologize for an argument. But evidence mounted quickly. Her journal contained chilling entries. "He belongs to me. He doesn't understand yet, but he will." Beneath that, taped to one page, was a piece of Daniel's mail she had stolen from his box. When the police searched her home, they found more. Dozens of photos of Daniel taken through his window, recordings of his voice from a hidden device near his car. And in the kitchen drawer, beneath folded towels, a small vial of antifreeze. Detectives believe she planned the killing for weeks. The moment of violence came quietly. No break-in, no struggle. She'd used the knowledge she'd gained from months of obsession to wait for her chance. Daniel's security system caught only one frame of her walking toward the door with a gift bag. They found his body 2 days later in his living room, a cup of tea beside him, traces of ethylene glycol in his system. When they brought her in for questioning, she didn't cry. She didn't resist. She only asked if he had suffered. Her voice calm and clinical, unnerved even seasoned detectives. "I didn't mean for him to hurt," she said. "I just didn't want him to forget me." At trial, her defense painted her as lonely, emotionally unstable, incapable of control after years of isolation. But prosecutors focused on the meticulousness, the journal, the poison, the weeks of stalking. This wasn't a moment of madness, the district attorney said. This was a teacher who studied her victim the way she once studied her students, carefully, methodically, until she knew exactly how to end him. The jury took 2 days. Guilty of first-degree murder, life in prison. The sentence read like a formality, but the emotion in the courtroom was heavier than any paper could bear. Daniel's sister wept when she heard the verdict. Mrs. Carver didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the floor, as if finally realizing that her story, her fantasy, had reached its final lesson. After her conviction, news outlets dissected every detail. Commentators debated mental illness, loneliness, and the dark psychology of fixation. Some former students wrote letters to her in prison, still trying to reconcile the woman who once taught them kindness with the one who had planned and carried out a killing. One letter, read aloud years later in a documentary, said, "You told us to believe in good people. You just never said what happens when good people stop believing in themselves." In prison, she withdrew from others, rarely speaking, spending most days writing letters she never sent. A guard once said that she spent hours staring out the window, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for someone who would never come. Her obsession, the thing that had consumed her, now turned inward. Quiet, endless, unbreakable. And maybe that's the most disturbing part. Not the act itself, but how easily love can rot into possession. How a person who spent her life teaching compassion could transform into something unrecognizable when loneliness turned to obsession. Because in the end, it wasn't rage that drove her. It was emptiness. The kind that eats away at reason until all that's left is the desperate need to be seen, even if it means destroying the very thing you claim to love. He was the teacher everyone trusted with the tough kids. The ones who skipped class, mouthed off, or fell asleep at their desks. Mr. Clay had a way of reaching them, of turning their anger into something useful. He coached basketball, ran after-school tutoring, and spent weekends volunteering at the youth center. When he walked through the halls, students called his name with genuine warmth. To most people, he was the example of what a good teacher could be. Patient, strong, dependable. But underneath that image, he carried a secret that would eventually destroy dozens of lives, including his own. It started small, with favors and promises. He'd lend money to struggling students, offer rides home, buy new shoes for kids who couldn't afford them. The principal praised him constantly, unaware that these gestures were part of something far more calculated. Over time, Clay began choosing certain students. Quiet ones, often from broken homes. The ones desperate for approval. He'd make them feel special, needed. He'd tell them they were family. For years, no one questioned him. He was the mentor every parent wanted their child to have. But one day, a mother showed up at the school office, trembling. Her daughter had confessed something that made her sick to her stomach. She said Mr. Clay had been visiting their house while she was at work, that he told her it was for tutoring. At first, the story seemed too strange, too impossible. Clay was respected, even beloved. But when police were called, one report turned into 3, then 5, then 10. Each one describing similar encounters, same methods, same quiet manipulation. The investigation uncovered a pattern spanning nearly a decade. Messages found on his phone showed the grooming process, the praise, the flattery, the guilt. He used his authority like a net, trapping kids in silence. When police confronted him, he denied everything, calm and measured, even as evidence mounted. They found secret folders on his computer, coded notes and hidden photos. The betrayal hit the community like a shockwave. In the following weeks, the story consumed local news. Cameras swarmed the courthouse and former students came forward to speak, their voices shaking. Some defended him, insisting it couldn't be true. Others broke down, describing years of fear and shame. Clay's wife filed for divorce the day after his arrest. His colleagues avoided eye contact in the hallways, afraid to be seen talking about him. The town's trust shattered almost overnight. The trial was brutal. The prosecution laid out everything in meticulous detail: text messages, phone logs, testimony from victims. They showed how he used his classroom as both a shield and a hunting ground, exploiting the same trust he'd earned through kindness. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the testimonies had been influenced by each other, but the weight of proof was undeniable. When the first victim took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke about how he told her she was different, that she had potential, that no one else understood her the way he did. She was only 14. Her voice broke halfway through, but she didn't stop. When she stepped down, the air in the room was heavy, not with anger, but with grief. Clay's reaction was unreadable. He sat still, eyes forward, hands folded neatly on the table. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, he didn't flinch. Only when the judge said the words, life imprisonment without parole, did his lips move, whispering something no one could hear. Some thought it was an apology. Others believed it was a prayer. After sentencing, reporters flooded the school, searching for answers. How could a man so trusted hide something so monstrous for so long? Administrators issued statements promising reforms, background checks, training. But the damage was done. The youth center where he'd volunteered shut down. His basketball team disbanded. Parents kept their children home for days, as though trust itself had become toxic. Inside prison, Clay became a ghost. Other inmates shunned him. Guards said he rarely spoke. He spent most of his time in the library, reading old history books, as if trying to find parallels for his own downfall. Once in an interview, he said, "I built everything around being needed." When that went away, I didn't know who I was. It was a hollow statement, one that felt less like regret and more like an explanation he gave himself to survive. Years later, a documentary revisited the case, not to sensationalize it, but to explore how authority can twist into something predatory when left unchecked. Former students described the duality of memory, the teacher who encouraged them and the man who destroyed others. One said, "He made us believe in ourselves, but he never believed in anything." There's something especially haunting about his story, because it isn't about sudden violence or madness, it's about corrosion. The slow, invisible decay of morality under the weight of power and loneliness. It forces us to look at the spaces we assume are safe, classrooms, teams, communities, and realize how easily they can become something else entirely. In the end, Mr. Clay's name became a symbol in that town, not just of guilt, but of caution. Teachers still walk the same halls, trying to rebuild trust. Parents still send their kids to class, hoping this time it's different. But somewhere, deep in the memory of that place, there's a lingering question that no one can quite erase. How well do we really know the people we trust with our children? The first sign that something was wrong came from the smell. The neighbors said it was faint at first, a sour, metallic odor drifting from the small rental house at the edge of town. They thought it might be a dead animal or garbage left too long in the summer heat. No one imagined it would lead police to the body of a missing student, or that the man responsible would be the same teacher who'd once been voted most inspirational educator 3 years in a row. His name was Mr. Dalton, a science teacher at a suburban high school just outside Denver. He was known for his experiments, explosions of colored chemicals, dry ice tricks, glowing plasma globes. Kids loved his enthusiasm, and parents adored the way he made science feel magical. He stayed after school for tutoring sessions, ran the robotics club, and wrote college recommendations for half the senior class. But behind his cheerful energy was a man quietly coming apart. Dalton's marriage had fallen apart months earlier. His wife left with their 2 children, citing erratic behavior and long absences she couldn't explain. Around the same time, he began forming what he called a mentorship with one of his students, a 17-year-old named Ashley. She was shy, academically gifted, and often stayed behind after class for help with chemistry. At first, it seemed harmless, a teacher helping a student prepare for college. But over time, his emails grew personal. Compliments turned to confessions. He told her she made him feel alive again. When Ashley stopped responding, Dalton's messages became erratic. He started showing up near her part-time job, leaving notes on her car. Her parents confronted him at the school, demanding he stay away, and filed a report with the district. The principal suspended him pending investigation, but Dalton disappeared before the hearing. That was in late August. By early September, Ashley had vanished too. For weeks, search teams combed through woods, lakes, and fields. Flyers covered telephone poles and store windows. News outlets broadcast her photo daily. The community gathered for vigils, candles glowing in the fading summer light. Dalton's name quickly became the center of suspicion. Police traced his last known location to a small rental property 30 miles away, a cabin he'd leased under his brother's name. When officers entered, they found the house silent and empty. The blinds were drawn. The fridge contained only energy drinks and takeout containers. And then there was the smell. In the basement, behind a sheet of plastic, they discovered what was left of Ashley. Wrapped carefully, methodically. The medical examiner later said she had been dead for more than 2 weeks. Dalton was found the next day, 2 states away, parked behind an abandoned gas station. He didn't run when officers approached. He didn't speak either. Just sat behind the wheel, staring at the empty road ahead, as though waiting for a bell to ring. In his car, detectives found a spiral notebook filled with pages of rambling notes. Part love letter, part confession, part delusion. "She understood me," one line read. "She was my only light." Another, "If I can't fix what's broken, I'll take it with me." The trial became one of the most covered in the state's history. Reporters filled the courtroom, faces of grieving parents in the background. Prosecutors described a man who blurred every moral boundary, who used his authority and intelligence to control a vulnerable girl. The defense argued mental collapse, claiming Dalton suffered from severe depression and dissociation following his divorce. But the evidence left little room for doubt. Witnesses testified to seeing him with Ashley outside school. Surveillance footage placed them together on the night she disappeared. DNA evidence confirmed what everyone feared. When the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder and unlawful restraint, the courtroom fell silent, except for the quiet sobbing of Ashley's mother. Dalton sat still, his expression vacant. He asked only one question before being led away. "Did she forgive me?" He was sentenced to life without parole. The robotics club disbanded. His classroom, once filled with color and laughter, was sealed and left untouched for months. Teachers whispered about the warning signs they had missed. The strange behavior, the isolation, the desperation that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. Years later, the school replaced his room with a counseling center. A plaque on the wall reads, "In memory of Ashley, who taught us the importance of speaking up." Every freshman passes it during orientation. Most of them don't know the full story, but the teachers do, and the silence that follows when someone asks about it says more than words ever could. In prison, Dalton never spoke to the media. Guards described him as withdrawn, spending most days reading or staring at the ceiling. A psychiatrist who evaluated him said he lived in a loop, replaying his final moments over and over, searching for justification he'd never find. There's something terrifying about stories like his, the ones that don't come from monsters, but from ordinary people who let loneliness rot into obsession. It makes us question how thin the line really is between compassion and control, between helping someone and owning them. Because Dalton wasn't a villain in his own mind. He was a man who thought he'd found connection, and when it slipped away, he destroyed it completely. In the end, that's what makes his story linger. Not the crime itself, but how easily it masqueraded as care. How every parent's trust, every student's faith in a mentor, can be shattered by one person who mistakes affection for possession. And how, in the quiet of a classroom, the distance between guidance and danger is sometimes no more than a single step. The first day of her trial, she wore the same calm smile she had in her classroom. It was the kind of expression that made parents trust her and students feel safe. Her name was Mrs. Halbrook, an English teacher from a small town in Mississippi, the kind who decorated her classroom with quotes from Shakespeare and shelves of second-hand novels. She believed in poetry, in patience, in the idea that every troubled student could be reached. But over the years, her kindness blurred into something darker. No one ever thought of her as dangerous. She wasn't loud or volatile, she didn't drink, she didn't gossip. She was quiet, thoughtful, a fixture of the local high school for almost 20 years. Students called her Halbrook the Heart because she never raised her voice and always offered second chances. But when a sophomore named Marcus started skipping class and failing assignments, she took an unusual interest. He was 16, quiet but sharp, raised by his grandmother after his parents' deaths. When she saw him sleeping in the library one morning, she woke him gently and told him he could stay after school if he needed help. That offer would change both of their lives forever. At first, it seemed like every other teacher-student dynamic. Late study sessions, handwritten notes of encouragement, packed lunches she said were extras. Marcus's grades improved. He even started smiling again. To outsiders, she looked like a hero, but inside her home she was unraveling. Her husband had left years earlier. Her only son had stopped speaking to her. Teaching was the one place she felt seen, respected, needed. And Marcus became the person who made her feel like she still mattered. It started with conversations that drifted too far from literature. She'd ask about his dreams, his fears, his loneliness. Then came the confessions, about how she hated her life, how she wished she could escape it. Marcus didn't know how to respond, but he tried to comfort her. He told her she was a good person. She told him he made her feel alive. Then one night she drove him home after a study session that went too late. It was raining hard, and she said it wasn't safe for him to walk. He got in the car. They talked about his future, about college, about getting out of the town. He later said she reached over and touched his hand. What happened next became the focus of every courtroom and news headline for the next 2 years. Marcus disappeared 3 weeks later. The police found his backpack in a creek behind Halbrook's property. Inside it were his phone, a torn page from The Great Gatsby, and a handwritten note that simply said, "I'm tired of pretending." For days she denied knowing anything. She told police she'd last seen him in class. But inconsistencies started piling up. Surveillance footage placed her car near the creek the night he vanished. A neighbor reported hearing loud arguments from her house, and when investigators searched her home, they found a section of the backyard that had been freshly disturbed. The discovery was devastating. Marcus's body was found wrapped in a blanket buried under layers of clay and leaves. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma and traces of sedatives in his system. In her bedroom, police found journals, hundreds of pages filled with her handwriting. In one entry, she described her fear of losing him. In another, she wrote, "He said he didn't love me, but I know what his eyes meant. I couldn't let them take him from me." The courtroom was silent when those passages were read aloud. Parents wept openly. Teachers who had once called her a mentor sat with their faces in their hands. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman whose loneliness consumed her, turning affection into possession. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, citing depression and emotional trauma, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury took less than 4 hours to return a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. When the judge sentenced her to life without parole, she nodded once, calm, almost relieved. As deputies led her away, she turned to Marcus's grandmother and said, "He was all I had." The grandmother didn't reply. She just stared at the woman who had stolen her grandson, as if trying to recognize the person who had once been trusted with his future. After the trial, the town struggled to recover. The school removed all mention of her from records. Her classroom was repainted, the books she'd donated boxed up and given away. But some of her students still remembered her lessons. The way she talked about tragedy, how she said every story is about love and loss, and how the difference between them often depends on what we're willing to destroy to keep what we love. Years later, when a documentary crew revisited the case, the reporter asked one of her former students what they remembered most about her. They said it wasn't her kindness or her calm voice. It was the way she once told them, "You can't save someone by holding them too tightly. They'll suffocate before they understand you meant well." The irony of that line haunts them still. In prison, Halbrook became a ghost, reading in the corner of the library, refusing interviews, never acknowledging her crime. A guard said she would sometimes whisper lines from the book she used to teach, as if reciting them back to herself for comfort. One of those lines, overheard again and again, was from Macbeth: "What's done cannot be undone." It's easy to see her story as madness, but that's too simple. It's about the slow decay of empathy, the way isolation and grief can twist even the gentlest intentions into something monstrous. She wasn't evil in the way we imagine villains to be. She was lonely, broken, and desperate to matter. But desperation doesn't excuse the destruction it causes. And maybe that's the most chilling part, that beneath every headline, every mugshot, there's someone who once just wanted to be needed. Until the moment they cross the line between love and control, and everything that once made them human became the reason they'll never walk free again. 6 teachers, 6 lives shattered by choices no one saw coming. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. Your thoughts might shape what we investigate next. He was the kind of teacher students remembered for his humor. Mr. Callan taught history at a middle school in northern Ohio, and he had a way of making the past feel alive, acting out battles, quoting presidents and cracking jokes that kept even restless teenagers entertained. Parents liked him too. He seemed genuine, approachable, harmless. But when the police finally opened his basement, they found evidence that told a very different story. It started when one of his students, a quiet 14-year-old named Brianna, stopped coming to class. Her parents thought she was skipping again. She'd been struggling since her father died the previous year. But when she didn't come home one night, panic spread fast. Flyers went up, search parties formed, and teachers volunteered to help. Mr. Callan was among them, handing out water bottles and organizing routes. On camera, he looked exhausted, sincere. He told reporters he couldn't imagine what her family was going through. No one suspected he already knew exactly where she was. The investigation began to shift after police traced Brianna's last text message. It had been sent from a phone tower less than a mile from Callan's house. When officers asked to search his property, he consented without hesitation. They found nothing upstairs. The basement, however, was locked, and he claimed he'd lost the key. They forced it open. The air was thick, metallic. In one corner was a small cot, blankets, a half-eaten sandwich, and a plastic chair bolted to the floor. On a nearby table sat a stack of notebooks and a camera pointed toward the cot. The walls were covered in soundproofing foam. In that moment, the officers realized they weren't dealing with a missing person. They were standing inside a cell. They found Brianna unconscious but alive, malnourished, terrified, bound. She'd been missing for nearly 2 weeks. Later, she told investigators he'd promised to help her with a school project after class, then offered to drive her home. She said she woke up in the basement unsure how she'd gotten there. When Callan was arrested, he didn't fight. He didn't even speak. He just stared at the flashing red and blue lights outside his house, as if watching his own story collapse in real time. In his possession, police found a detailed journal, not unlike lesson plans, outlining what he called phases. Each entry described a method of control, psychological manipulation, isolation, and dependency. It read like something out of a study on coercion. And it was written in the same neat handwriting he used on the classroom whiteboard. The trial that followed horrified the country. Prosecutors presented video evidence, testimony, and his own written confessions. His defense claimed insanity, arguing he'd been suffering from untreated trauma stemming from a childhood of abuse. But the sheer calculation of his actions shattered that narrative. He had planned everything, from the timing of the abduction to the locks on the basement door. When Brianna testified, she didn't cry. She sat still, voice trembling but clear. She told the court that he used to talk to her like a father figure, saying he understood her pain, that he told her the world was cruel, but he could keep her safe, that he promised she'd never have to be alone again. Then she looked at him and said, "You said you cared about me, but you only cared about control." The jury returned a guilty verdict in less than a day. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. In his final statement, Callan said only, "I didn't mean for it to end this way." The courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of Brianna's mother whispering that he'd already made that choice the moment he locked the door. After the sentencing, reporters tried to piece together how no one had noticed the signs. There had been whispers, complaints from former students about his strange compliments, rumors of private tutoring sessions that lasted too long. But in small towns, people tend to believe the best about those who teach their children. The line between trust and denial blurs easily when the face of the threat smiles every morning from behind a desk. Years later, Brianna rebuilt her life. She moved to another state, changed her name, and became an advocate for victims of educator misconduct. She once said in an interview that she no longer blames herself for trusting him. "He used kindness as a weapon," she said. "He made me believe I mattered, but only so I'd stay quiet when he crossed the line." In prison, Callan rarely speaks. Guards describe him as methodical, still teaching, though now his audience is the other inmates. He gives lectures about history in the yard, pacing and gesturing as if the classroom still surrounds him. Some say it's delusion, others say it's denial. Maybe in his mind he's still in control of a story that long stopped belonging to him. What lingers most about his case isn't just what he did, but how normal he seemed while doing it. How someone could live two lives so convincingly that even those closest to him never saw the cracks forming beneath the surface. It's a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always arrive in chaos. Sometimes it hides behind kindness, routine, and a teacher's smile. Because in the end, it wasn't the monster under the bed that terrified a community. It was the man who stood at the front of a classroom, telling stories about the past, while quietly writing one of the darkest chapters of his own. When she first walked into the courtroom, people whispered that she looked more like a librarian than a killer. Thin, quiet, glasses perched low on her nose, the kind of woman who'd blend into the background of any faculty lounge. Her name was Mrs. Langford, and for nearly 25 years she'd taught mathematics at a small-town high school in Oregon. She was known for her precision, her strictness, and her belief that discipline and logic could fix anything. But behind the tidy lesson plans and color-coded gradebooks was a life built entirely on control. And when that control began to slip, she resorted to something unthinkable. It began when her husband, a fellow teacher, announced that he was leaving her. The divorce papers cited emotional cruelty, a term few understood until later. He moved out, and soon after, rumors began to spread that he had been seeing someone else, another teacher, younger, newly hired to the same department. The school tried to manage the awkwardness, separating schedules, shifting classrooms. But for Mrs. Langford, it was humiliation. She couldn't bear being whispered about, couldn't stand the sympathetic smiles from students who'd overheard gossip. The structure she'd spent her life maintaining, her marriage, her reputation, her identity, began to fracture. In the months that followed, colleagues noticed changes. Her lessons became erratic. She lost her temper over small mistakes. She started wearing dark sunglasses indoors, complaining of migraines. Then one morning, the new teacher, her husband's partner, failed to show up for class. Her car was still in the parking lot. Her phone was found inside. At first, everyone assumed she'd fallen ill. But by that evening, police were involved. By midnight, a search team was combing the nearby woods. And by dawn, they'd found her body, buried under a pile of leaves less than half a mile from Mrs. Langford's home. The crime scene told a story that investigators couldn't ignore. The victim had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. Nearby, police found a broken pair of reading glasses and a thermos, the same kind Mrs. Langford carried every day. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Teachers wept. Students couldn't comprehend that the quiet woman who'd spent years teaching them algebra was now suspected of murder. Langford denied everything. She told detectives she'd been home grading papers. But evidence told another story. Security footage placed her car near the trail where the body was found. Soil samples from her tires matched the burial site, and a neighbor recalled seeing her dragging something heavy into her shed days before the arrest. When police searched it, they found a blood-stained tarp, gardening tools, and a journal. That journal, like her lesson plans, was organized, methodical, chillingly detailed. Pages outlined her resentment toward her husband, her jealousy, her growing hatred for the woman she blamed for ruining her life. One entry read, "She took what was mine. Balance must be restored." Another, "If I can't be the teacher, I'll become the lesson." The trial drew nationwide coverage. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Psychologists debated whether the crime was a moment of passion or years of repression exploding at once. Her defense argued temporary insanity, that decades of bottled emotion and humiliation had pushed her to a psychotic break. The prosecution countered with the precision of her actions, the planning, the cleanup, the journal. They painted her as a woman addicted to control, who couldn't accept the chaos of a life she no longer commanded. During sentencing, the judge said her crime was as cold as it was tragic. He told her, "You built a career teaching logic, yet you acted on pure madness." She showed no visible emotion as the words, "life in prison without parole," echoed through the courtroom. Only when her ex-husband took the stand to deliver his victim statement did her mask finally break. He said he had once admired her discipline, until he realized it wasn't strength but fear. He said she didn't kill because she loved him, but because she couldn't stand to lose. For the first time, she cried. In prison, Langford adapted quickly. Routine came naturally to her. The structure, the rules, the repetition. Guards said she kept her cell spotless, organized by color and category. She volunteered to tutor inmates in math. She never spoke about the murder and never once mentioned her husband. To some, she seemed at peace. To others, she was simply living in the only system she could still control. Her story became a kind of legend in the education community, a cautionary tale about obsession, pride, and the quiet pressure of perfection. Students who once feared her discipline now remembered her as something else. A warning about what happens when the need to control the world outside becomes greater than the ability to understand the chaos within. There's something especially haunting about her case. Not just the violence, but the transformation. How someone so rational, so composed, could unravel so completely. How the same mind that solved equations and preached balance could justify murder as symmetry. Because in the end, Mrs. Langford didn't just destroy another life. She destroyed the very order she spent decades building. And maybe that's why her story lingers. Because it shows how even the most intelligent, disciplined people can become prisoners of their own logic when emotion finally breaks through the cracks. The snow was falling the night the police knocked on his door. It was the kind of quiet, muffled snowfall that made the whole town feel asleep. But inside that small, one-story house, officers found a scene that would keep the community awake for years to come. His name was Mr. Travis Boyd, a beloved elementary school teacher in rural Minnesota. For 2 decades, he'd been the man parents trusted with their children. His classroom was bright, full of art projects and hand-drawn maps. He coached Little League, ran the spelling bee, and volunteered at every holiday fair. Everyone said the same thing. He'd never hurt anyone. But they were wrong. It began with whispers, subtle, uncertain. A student told a guidance counselor that Mr. Boyd had given her gifts. Another said he'd been texting late at night, sending messages that didn't sound like something a teacher should write. At first, the school district brushed it off as overreaction. He was well-respected, kind, adored by the community. But when the number of reports grew, the district placed him on leave. He called it a witch hunt. He said the kids were confused, manipulated by angry parents. The investigation stalled. Then, 3 months later, one of those students disappeared. Her name was Chloe, 12 years old. She was last seen leaving a piano lesson one evening in February. Police scoured the town, combing through snowbanks and frozen ponds. Boyd even joined the search party, handing out flyers, hugging her parents. He cried on local news, begging for her safe return. But when investigators traced her last phone location, it led them directly to his street. They searched his home. He greeted them calmly, said he had nothing to hide. They found Chloe in the basement freezer. The room fell silent when they opened it. The officers, the forensics team, the neighbors who'd gathered outside as word spread. The scene was beyond comprehension. The town that had trusted him now watched as police led him away in handcuffs, his breath visible in the cold air, his face expressionless. The sheriff later said it was the only time in his career he saw every single officer in tears. The trial became a national sensation. Prosecutors revealed that Boyd had been grooming several students over years, using kindness and gifts as cover. He'd built relationships with their families, attended birthdays, even babysat. Every gesture of generosity was calculated. Every compliment was a piece of a larger manipulation. The prosecution's key evidence was a collection of letters found in a locked drawer of his classroom desk. Handwritten in neat, childish handwriting, the letters Chloe never meant for anyone else to read. They told the story of a girl confused, trapped between affection and fear. He said, "I'm special," one letter read. He said, "No one else understands." When the jury heard that, the room fell silent except for the sound of her mother sobbing. Boyd showed no emotion throughout the trial. He sat motionless as witnesses described the betrayal, as parents recounted the years of trust, as former students wept, describing how he'd made them feel safe, right up until the moment they realized what he really was. The defense tried to argue mental illness, claiming dissociation and trauma, but the judge rejected it outright, calling his actions a sustained campaign of deception and destruction. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in tears, relief, rage, disbelief. Chloe's father stared straight ahead, saying nothing while Boyd was led away. Afterward, the town all but erased him. The school burned every photo, every certificate, every mention of his name. His classroom was gutted. The playground was renamed after Chloe. But the damage couldn't be undone. Parents spoke in hushed tones. Teachers double-checked their own behavior, terrified of ever being misunderstood. Years later, a reporter interviewed the lead investigator on the case. He said something that stuck. "We all wanted him to be innocent, because if he wasn't, then that meant anyone could be capable of it. And that's the hardest truth, that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like the man who teaches your kid to read. In prison, Boyd became infamous. He refused interviews, refused counseling, refused to explain. Inmates avoided him. Guards said he spent most of his time staring at the wall, humming softly, as if still teaching imaginary lessons to a class that no longer existed. One of the guards said he once whispered the same phrase over and over. "I just wanted to be someone they remembered." And they did remember him, but not the way he wanted. Not as a teacher, not as a mentor, but as the man who shattered the last safe space children had. What makes his story truly horrifying isn't just the crime itself, but the betrayal of what he represented. A teacher's job is to guide, to protect, to inspire. He did the opposite. He used that sacred role as a mask. And when the truth came out, the community didn't just lose a child. They lost faith. Because after Travis Boyd, every parent hesitated before trusting again. Every child learned that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes, they stand in front of a whiteboard, smiling, asking if you've done your homework. For more than 15 years, everyone at Crestview High thought of Mr. Harlan as the kind of teacher every school needed. He taught art, soft-spoken, patient, always carrying a sketchbook under his arm. Students said he saw the best in everyone, even the troublemakers. He'd tell them that art wasn't about talent, but truth. But when police uncovered the truth behind his calm demeanor, it painted a picture of something monstrous. A man who turned creation into cruelty. It started with his wife's disappearance. She was a local sculptor, often seen selling small ceramic pieces at weekend markets. They'd been married nearly 20 years, and to everyone else, they seemed like the perfect creative couple. Quiet, humble, deeply connected. But according to neighbors, the last year had been tense. Shouting late at night, doors slamming. Then one evening in March, she vanished. Harlan told police she'd left him. He said she'd run off with another artist. He even produced an email, supposedly from her, saying she needed time to find herself. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. The writing style was different. The timestamps didn't match. When they examined his studio, they found her phone sealed in a plastic container under a pile of old sketches. The messages on it told a darker story: threats, jealousy, and a growing obsession with control. Weeks turned into months. Then a student, one of Harlan's seniors, came forward, saying he'd asked her to model for a final art piece at his home studio. When police followed up, they found something chilling. In his basement, Harlan had built what he called an installation. It was made of plaster, wood, and resin, a life-sized human figure, eerily lifelike, wrapped in gauze and sealed under layers of hardened compound. Forensics confirmed what everyone feared. Inside the sculpture was the body of his missing wife. The discovery sent shockwaves across the state. The headlines were surreal. Beloved art teacher used wife's body in sculpture. It was the kind of horror story people assumed was fiction until they saw the photographs. Harlan was arrested at the school the next morning. He didn't resist. He simply looked at the officers and said, "You found her, didn't you?" At trial, prosecutors revealed a twisted obsession with immortality. They presented journal entries and sketches that described his desire to preserve beauty forever. He believed death could be transformed through art. They found that he'd spent weeks crafting the sculpture, coating her remains layer by layer, documenting the process as though it were a project. He had even titled it Eternal Form. His defense claimed insanity, citing artistic delusion and mental collapse. Psychologists testified that he saw his wife's death not as murder, but as creation. But the prosecution countered with evidence that he'd purchased materials, researched preservation methods, and planned every detail. It wasn't madness. It was method. When the verdict came, guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. His former students wept. One said, "He taught me that art was supposed to make people feel. I just never thought it would feel like this." The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole, calling his crime an act of possession masquerading as passion. In the years that followed, journalists and documentarians tried to understand him. Some described him as a narcissist who mistook control for love. Others said he was a man who believed beauty justified anything. When asked why he'd done it, Harlan once told a prison psychiatrist, "I didn't kill her. I preserved her." The world forgets beauty too easily. The psychiatrist's report called it the language of delusion mixed with guilt. The school board removed his name from every record. His art classroom was shut down for a year, then reopened with new paint and no trace of the past. Students avoided the room, saying it felt heavy, haunted by the ghost of what had happened. The sculpture itself was destroyed, but photos remain in evidence files, haunting reminders of the way creation and destruction can merge in the darkest corners of the human mind. In prison, Harlan continued to draw. His sketches were confiscated multiple times for containing disturbing imagery. Faces without eyes, bodies merging with walls, hands reaching from the page. Guards said he worked silently, obsessively, as though still trying to perfect the one piece that ruined his life. There's something profoundly unsettling about his story. Not just the crime, but the intent behind it. He didn't kill in rage or hatred, but in a warped vision of love and permanence. It forces the question, what happens when obsession with beauty turns into fear of loss? When the desire to preserve becomes the act that destroys? Because in the end, Harlan's greatest masterpiece wasn't something he created. It was the illusion he lived inside. A world where love could be molded, controlled, and frozen forever. But love isn't art. It breathes. It changes, and when he tried to stop that change, he turned the thing he loved most into a monument of horror. Now, in a prison cell lined with sketches and silence, he's left with only that truth, that in trying to capture beauty, he killed it. And that's a lesson no one can unlearn. 12 stories, 12 reminders that even those we trust the most can hide the darkest secrets. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the shadows of human nature. Because where trust ends, the crime begins.